debate on multimodal transportation issues. At today's webinar, we're going to be talking about how the media covers transportation policies, programs, projects, and major incidents. Typically, our webinars are about 45 minutes long, but since we are very lucky to have four professional storytellers with us today, we're going to go for a full hour. First, we have Andrew Hawkins. He's the transportation editor at The Verge. Then Rachel Swan, transportation reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle. Joanna Green, she leads the Office of Public Affairs at Maryland DOT. And batting cleanup, Larry Higgs. He's a transportation reporter at New Jersey Star Ledger. They're each going to talk for about 5 minutes, and then we'll take questions from all of you. Whenever you want, you can enter questions into the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many of those questions as possible. We hope you enjoy our webinar, and we also hope you can support Eno by donating or becoming a member. Just check out the link in the chat box. And with that, here's Andrew.
Thanks, Phil. And thanks to Eno for convening this webinar and for inviting me to participate. I'm very honored to be featured on this panel with all these esteemed journalists and professionals and to be speaking to all of you. And I look forward to your questions as well. As you mentioned, my name is Andrew Hawkins. I'm the transportation editor at The Verge. And if you're not familiar with The Verge is a digital media publication. It's owned by Vox Media. And for around 15 years or so, we've been covering the intersection of technology and culture. And it's become very interesting because I think over that period of time, in many ways, our culture has become increasingly dominated and defined by the technology that we use. So lots of stories to tell in this realm, and obviously lots of stories to tell on the transportation beat. So I just wanted to sort of very quickly walk through sort of some of the areas that The Verge covers on our desk, our transportation desk. But I also wanted to mention that I also oversee our science desk as well. And there's a lot of overlap between transportation and science, which I find to be very exciting and thrilling. As a digital media publication, we are sort of very nimble and fast on our feet. We obviously report on all of the daily news that touches the topics that we cover, whether it's the technology industry, Silicon Valley, the major tech companies from Apple to Amazon to SpaceX to Tesla. And we provide just a range of reviews on a variety of technology products, from laptop computers to televisions. And then on my beat, we review electric cars, electric bikes, electric scooters, and in addition to some of the enterprise reporting and investigative reporting that we do as well. So it's news, it's daily news, it's long form features, enterprise reporting. We offer a range of social media features and video projects as well. We try to sort of cover the gamut. So what do we do? What do we cover at on the transportation desk? Well, primarily it's been for the last several years been dominated by the news around the rise of electric vehicles, electric vehicle batteries, sort of the push towards zero emission transportation, this historic shift that has been taking place in the auto industry, and then obviously within the most recently, these very jarring policy shifts that we've had under the Trump administration and what that has meant for the auto industry and electric vehicle adoption. We also cover very closely the rise of robo-taxis and autonomous vehicles. And that includes obviously major companies like Waymo, smaller companies like, Zoox and Motional, but, and then sort of outliers like Tesla and sort of how they're kind of approaching the technology much differently than some of the more established players. And we also, cover some of the other form factors, which include self-driving trucks, commercial vehicles, and then some of how that technology filters down to the consumer market in the form of driver assist features, and just sort of like what it means when we hand over the keys to robots, essentially, right? We're a nation very much defined by driving and car culture. So what does that mean when robots start to take over that aspect of our culture as well? We also cover very closely this idea of cars increasingly becoming driven by software and digital interfaces. So I'm sure all of you have been inside a car where there's a giant screen or maybe a more medium-sized screen and many software features that are inside that vehicle. This is a trend in the auto industry that we're covering very closely around the idea of software-defined vehicles, vehicles that can have over-the-air software updates, sort of in the same way that our phones are updated, and what that means for maintenance, for long-term ownership. And then obviously you have your phone projection systems like Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, and how the auto industry has been responding to sort of these incursions by these major tech companies like Google and Apple into the interface in their vehicles. Um, we also cover ride hailing, ride sharing, Uber and Lyft, sort of these transportation network companies, the way that they have been interacting with their drivers through hiring independent contractors, the conflicts and tension that has arisen from some of the ways that those companies have defined their workforce. And how these companies are increasingly becoming global companies. They're becoming platforms for autonomous vehicles and robotaxis, and what that's going to mean for transportation in dense urban cores and cities, mid-sized cities. What happens when Uber becomes sort of the primary broker of autonomous vehicles. Um, a subject that we cover, I mentioned this briefly, but it's very near and dear to my heart. I'm a cyclist. I love cycling. I love being on my bike way more than I love being behind the wheel of a car. So we cover a lot of sort of the ups and downs of the bike industry, the rise of electric bikes. Obviously there's been a lot of policy decisions made recently here in my home state of New Jersey and elsewhere around sort of this problem of young people, especially riding increasingly more powerful e-motos and electrified motorcycles, and what policymakers and how they're responding to some of those challenges. And also just sort of the idea of replacing car trips with micromobility, with electric bikes, and what that's going to mean for our communities and how they're planned and designed. Um, we covered public transportation, maybe not as closely as some other folks here in the chat, but we try to include public transportation on our desk as well. Obviously, there are still ripple effects from the pandemic that are affecting many transit agencies across the country, and we're a national publication, so we try to pay attention to that as closely as we possibly can. And also, sort of how public transit agencies are responding and trying to adapt to a more digital age, and people with trip planning on their phones, and sort of trying to become a more efficient customer-facing enterprise. And then there's been a lot of innovation and change and disruption in the aviation industry, while we're still sort of dealing with fallout from various airlines and the problems that they have in servicing their customers. There's been all sorts of sort of problems with air traffic control recently. We've been doing a lot of deep diving into some of the problems with our ATC systems, and how increasingly those professionals are relying on outdated modes of managing our airspace, and how we're trying to update that and try to make that a more efficient process. And then just lastly, I would say that we are obviously very much interested at The Verge in the policy, regulation, the political polarization of our nation, obviously under the Trump administration, especially. And then, sort of like more broadly, how the car has gotten kind of, or the act of driving or car ownership has been sort of sucked into the broader culture wars. And we've seen that sort of in how sort of some of these political campaigns have taken, sort of have seized upon the idea of electric vehicles, especially, and used that as sort of a wedge to drive people apart. So yeah, that's sort of in a nutshell what we do and what we cover at The Verge. It's a very fast-moving environment. It's very exciting. I've been working here for over 10 years now, and I say this all the time. It's the best job I've ever had, and I love covering this beat, and I really appreciate being able to share this with you guys.
Great. Thanks, Andrew. So, Rachel in San Francisco, can you go next?
Thank you so much. Yeah. Just making sure everyone can hear me. Yes. Okay. I was delighted to hear Andrew's introduction and find somewhat actually to my surprise how much of what you cover at The Verge intersects with what I cover. I'm musty, old-fashioned legacy media, San Francisco Chronicle, obviously regional newspaper. However, we're based in the like what I would like to call the spiritual home of tech, San Francisco. We are sorry to humble bragging here, but the original laboratory for Waymo, and a place where a lot of these like autonomous vehicles are getting tested and starting there to expand their fleets. So that gives me a lot of latitude to cover um, what's happening in Silicon Valley, these new technologies, stuff that you wouldn't necessarily think that lay people are always interested in. Um, because AV ride hails are so established in San Francisco, there's a lot of, like sort of everyday zeitgeisty articles that have to deal with, that relate to regular people's interactions with AVs. They're taking my parking spaces, are they causing congestion? Like you don't even have to get super wonky. We're also I'm also in an area that is a hotbed for these new, what they, is it EVTOLs, the air taxis,
Mhm.
So I get to indulge, sort of my nerdy impulses covering some of that. We have real estate developers who are theoretically building homes, housing complexes with helipads now, so um, I get to do a lot of some of this interesting futuristic coverage, probably a little less wonky than The Verge, but there's a lot of just like in the San Francisco Bay Area, there's a lot of like regular human interaction with pretty futuristic technologies. Um, a lot of what I cover is public transportation, where we're in a huge crisis here in the Bay Area. There's sort of this sword of Damocles hanging over everyone that, particular our regional rail system, BART, may have to shut down a number of stations if voters decide, which they may, that they don't want to bail it out in November. There's a lot of very heated politics around transportation. Uh, you know, um, Bicycles, whether or not, where to build bike lanes, who are the roads for, a lot of the stuff that you see everywhere in the country. I mean, that's very much the bread and butter of what I cover. Um, Parking, um, and we are starting to cover, like Andrew mentioned, a lot of the e-bike, e-motos. There's been a real rise of e-motos, here, less in San Francisco than in the surrounding suburbs, because I almost think they're almost they've proven to be more of a suburban form of micromobility. So that's caused a lot of conflict. So, I mean, my favorite stories are really about, you know, human engagement with sort of like, I hate to be cliche, but like bringing the humanity into it. Like when I first started this beat, I thought, okay, I'm not going to be no good at it because I don't have a really great engineering mindset. And, I don't always know like what is a bridge, what is a viaduct, blah, 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 like what are what are the trusses and what are the blah. But it turns out that it's really a beat with a lot of, that people really relate to because it affects their everyday lives, and a lot of it is about like how delayed is your transit system going to be, and who does get to use the streets, like who is prioritized, are the streets for cars, are they for bikes, can we all get along here? So yeah, it's been kind of a really, really enjoyable and enriching beat, and I will stop talking. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Rachel. And before I go to Joanna, just a reminder, there's a Q&A feature. And if you click in some questions, we'll be getting to your answers after we hear from all of our panelists here. All right, Joanna, can you go next?
Absolutely. Again, I'm Joanna Green. I'm the Assistant Secretary of Transportation at the Maryland Department of Transportation. And my portfolio includes managing and how do we communicate not only with the media, these illustrious folks here on this panel, but also how do we communicate with the communities that rely on public transit, whether they're transit dependent, whether they need to use our roads, whether they need to use our services, bridges, tunnels, tolls. Here at the state of Maryland, we have a multimodal operation. So essentially, we cover the airports, we cover seaports, we manage things like highways, tunnels, bridges, tolls, public transportation, mobility transportation, the highways. So there's so many aspects of the work that we do. And my role really is to how do we communicate to all of these different constituencies? Our constituencies are the people, number one, the taxpayers of Maryland. These are the folks who invest their hard-earned dollars to keep the infrastructure system running and working for them. But then we have constituencies, whether they are elected officials, both the local and federal level. And then we also have international constituencies. Maryland is a port city that is number one for things like roll-on, roll-off cargo. So how do we market and talk about the services that we have from a shipping and international trade perspective? Many of you heard about Baltimore and specifically the Maryland Transit Administration or Transportation Administration because of the collapse of the Key Bridge. So one important aspect of what we do beyond the proactive messaging around services for our customers, like how do we mitigate in the times of crisis? I probably was one of the first 4 to 5 people who was notified when that bridge collapsed, and we instantly had to go into a mode of working with emergency response teams as well as executive leaders from across the world. Because again, we are an international port. So a key component of what we do is transparency. I think, we talk about how we cultivate messaging, but really I lead by transparency. I think I use this mantra that it's okay to be wrong. It's okay to make mistakes, but you have to own up to them. But also when you do things well, own up to that too. I think we certainly have a complex system with competing needs, but we're doing all this in a backdrop where transportation is not necessarily a priority in the current climate, political climate. We look at nations across the world, specifically nations that are moving ahead financially and economically. These are people who invest heavily in transportation infrastructure. They know the value of moving people and connecting people to jobs, connecting people to opportunities, to technologies. And so these are all things that we have to contend with in a state like Maryland. We also have to think about technologies and how these technologies either improve or put people at risk. So we have a program called the Pedestrian Safety Program that looks at things like e-bikes, or even the advent of how do we use AI in predictive modeling, in solving for challenges that we have, whether it's autonomous vehicles, whether it's drone activity that happens in our regions. There's so many complex issues that happen in the field of transportation, especially when you have a multimodal organization, and they all have competing needs for dollars, technologies, attention, safety, all of those things. So I'll close with this. For 2026, our campaign, or the overarching campaign for our organization, is serious about safety. One of the things that we're struggling with now is preventable crashes where we have our employees who are being killed by distracted drivers. We have roadway workers who are doing things like picking up trash or assisting broken down vehicles. We're doing construction who are being killed by people and distracted drivers. 3 weeks ago, we had 2 employees killed within 48 hours, both killed by distracted driving incidents. So as we look at some of the things that are impacting us, how the role that technology plays in either distracting people or encouraging people to be more responsible, we're still trying to thread the needle. And of course, we're dealing with things like the Waymo's of the world and making sure that the policies and regulations that we put forth that govern transportation in our state are progressive, but at the end of the day, safe for everyone. So I yield, and it's a pleasure to be on this panel with such an illustrious group of reporters. Thank you.
Thanks, Joanna. All right, and Larry?
Thanks. And thanks for having me. It's very interesting to be on a panel of such esteemed people. Transportation reporters are not as plentiful as environmental reporters or education reporters, so it's nice to see that there are a few of us around. So having listened to what everybody said, there are 2 things that I can say. First of all, I work for NewJersey.com, NJ.com, and the Star Ledger. We're a legacy publication that has pretty much evolved into a digital publication. We made headlines because we stopped printing our legacy newspaper roughly about a year ago. I mean, we still offer a copy of it online for those people who want that format, but it was something that made ripple effects. But it was also a business decision because people are changing how they get the news, and digital is basically king. So the other thing I would mention is based on what everybody said, is that there is always a New Jersey aspect to a story. That's one of our mantras in the newsroom. If you dig deep enough, there's going to be some kind of New Jersey person or New Jersey aspect or agency or what have you involved in it. The other thing is all the issues that everyone else on the panel brought up ripple across the United States. So, for example, the collapse of the Key Bridge, there was a Jersey story in there because we have two giant container ports. And the question was, with all these bridges and giant container ships, which of our bridges are structured, basically subject to being hit and are basically structurally, you know, looking for the right word, but structurally deficient that could collapse. Mercifully, the Port Authority built a lot of their bridges, so the anchorages are not in the channel. So, I mean, a ship would run aground. But there are other bridges in the state, down in the southern region of the state, down in the Delaware Bay, where they actually have to go and do some retrofitting to protect their bridge pillars. Issues that were mentioned about e-bikes, that was a big one for us because we kind of made national news with what's considered the most restrictive e-bike law in the United States that basically regulates all e-bikes and requires them to get owners to register them and insure them like a car. The advocates community is saying, well, really, you need to be going after the e-motos. And again, like some of the other states, or the other people have mentioned, we've had some tragic accidents, and the problem is the e-motos are behind that. Autonomous vehicles, they're just getting their start in New Jersey. There's legislation that right now autonomous vehicles require a human driver. The industry is fighting against that. So, we have legislation about that. Public transportation is a huge issue in New Jersey because we're kind of right behind New York as far as the percentage of the population. We range between 9 and 10% who take public transportation either to New York or to Philadelphia. It's a huge commuting state. We're part of a region where 20% of the gross domestic product is generated in this region, and it's fueled by commuters coming from states like New Jersey, upstate New York, Westchester, and Connecticut into New York City to work, and also to a lesser extent going to Philadelphia. So there's a huge commuter population here. Congestion pricing in New York, first one of its country, and New Jersey was fighting that tooth and nail because we looked upon it as a tax on our commuters. There was a lot of political ill will between the two states about whether revenue should be shared with New Jersey agencies. So that's another one. Transportation funding, as was mentioned about BART, that was a huge issue in New Jersey. We have a corporate transit fee, which basically is a tax on the profits of the largest corporations. And it bailed out New Jersey Transit, so New Jersey Transit doesn't face the kind of tough decisions that BART is facing and that SEPTA faced, but it's a 5-year piece of legislation. The governor has to make a decision what to do with it in 5 years. There's always been a constant push and pull about how to fund transportation. We're one of the states where the governor just united the head of the New Jersey Turnpike Authority, the major toll road authority, with New Jersey Transit to try to get some unity in transportation planning instead of having siloed information operations. We have a State Department of Transportation that deals with highways. We have 2 state toll agencies. We have numerous regional toll agencies, including the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, one of the biggest. So there are a lot of decisions that are made by different organizations, and it kind of leaves the user scratching their head saying, well, who's responsible for what I just drove over? And that's one of the things that we do. We answer these questions for people. Readers come to me. If I write a story about a particular piece of infrastructure, readers will contact me and they say, well, what about this highway project, that highway project, this transit project? When are we going to see light rail in Bergen County? And there's a lot of explanation that has to be done in layman's terms to explain them why it's taking so long. You know, that's our editorial writers, they'll make the judgment whether that's good or bad. We have Newark Airport. A lot of you are familiar with Newark Airport because of the air traffic control meltdown we had last year, where basically radar went blank for 90 terrifying seconds, and it started the national debate about what to do with our air traffic control system. Caps were put on the airport. It's one of United's biggest hubs, and the airline would like to see some of that cap removed because they're under pressure. There's demand. There's constant demand. We had an incident a couple of weeks ago where a landing United plane kind of hit a lamppost on the turnpike and contacted a tractor trailer on the highway. And you go back into history and you find out that this was one of a series of old runways. There were 10 of them at Newark Airport that were constructed in the dawn of the airport before the Port Authority took it over. And it's one of the ones where if you're ever driving on the New Jersey Turnpike, you will see a line of planes just waiting to come over the Turnpike extension, and they roar over the toll plaza. So, again, we explain to people why that's happening. Why are they using these runways? Multimodal is a big thing here. We have a lot of cities like the city I live in, Jersey City. There's a lot of big bike and pedestrian movements. There are bike advocacy groups looking for more bike lanes. We have a lot of development here, and the roads just cannot simply handle it. So a lot of people are turning to multimodal solutions, but there's also pushback from car drivers, legacy versus what's new. Projects are a big one. We have the Gateway Project, the biggest $16 billion project to build 2 new Hudson River tunnels. There were a lot of political aspects that we covered when Trump had cut frozen funding. We kind of led the way on digging into the esoteric little rules that led to that funding being frozen in a 24-hour period. The rule debuted on October 31st. The letters were sent to Gateway saying, hi, we're freezing your funding until you prove to us that you comply with these rules. Very much of a political decision. The 2 states and Gateway went into court, fought it. The money is flowing, and it's a constant battle to make sure that that money does flow. The interesting thing about this state, I always joke with people that I never go to work and say, oh my God, what am I going to do today? I'm going to be bored to death, drooling on my keyboard. This state has the densest population as far as population compared to landmass, not as far as intelligence. Although if you drove on our roadways, you might dispute that. We have legacy infrastructure. The Pulaski Skyway, which has taken 10 years to rebuild, was originally built to railroad standards in the 1930s because no highway bridge standards existed. It's probably why that bridge it lasted for 75 years with bare maintenance. So when they pulled up the pavement, they found horrible rust where they didn't expect rust to be. So they had to shut down half of the highway, major route to New York. And the interesting thing was, for the driving side, people were afraid it would be called something called Carmageddon because it was one of a couple of routes across the Hackensack and Passaic rivers to get to the major arteries to Manhattan. And the irony is, traffic found a way. So we also talk about that, the culture of commuting. I did a story about a guy who has an Instagram account because all he does is shoot videos of bad drivers. And, the first one he shot got 1 million page views. So it's kind of the soup to nuts on that. And I could probably hog up this entire panel and I'm not gonna. So take it away.
Okay. First, I'm going to ask a question about the relationship between transportation agencies and the media. So first, I'll ask the reporters from their perspective, why should they care about what you do? And do they help you? Do they hinder you? Are they trying to get you to write certain stories? They're trying to get you to not write certain stories. How does that relationship work? So let me start with, we'll go Andrew, Rachel, Larry, and Joanna on this one.
Sure. Yeah. I don't do a lot of reporting on state DOTs or national publications who are mostly concerned with national policy. I've had many interactions with US DOT
Yeah.
over the years, and I mean, like it largely depends on the administration that's in place at the time. Under the Biden administration, they were very eager to pitch story ideas. I interviewed Pete Buttigieg a number of times over the course of his tenure about a number of topics about self-driving car policy, about infrastructure, about the attempts to sort of put in place a new sort of DARPA initiative around infrastructure. We also did a sort of an exit interview after he was leaving. He left the position. Have not had much interaction with the current U.S. DOT. I've reached out to them a number of times for comment around some NHTSA policies. They're always responsive, but there's not as much sort of back and forth as there was under the Biden administration. I think they have their own sort of media policies and media outlets that they would prefer to interact with. I don't think it really includes the Verge on that list. But yeah, that's sort of been my interactions with US DOT, but less so state DOTs. If there's like certain policies that are of national import, I've had conversations with folks at NYC DOT and some other of the big state DOTs around some of their autonomous vehicle policies. Obviously, I have a lot of interest in California's DMV because of the very robust system that they have in place regulating autonomous vehicles in that state. But that's sort of an outlier because California was very much first in getting that system in place. And a lot of the other states are still kind of really playing catch up, I think, in that area.
Okay. So Rachel, just a reminder, the question was like your relationship with transportation agencies, and do they understand the importance of it, and like how does that relationship work?
You know, that's such an interesting question, Philip, because I do interact with I interact with high-speed rail, communications, BART, obviously, Muni, so several, and they all have different cultures. And if I'm being honest, and I have said this to the communications people with whom I sometimes clash, just being completely honest, like I think we have different objectives, in a lot of cases. Um, there's one agency I interact with that their objective is very much to protect their people, to protect the government and the officials who are in charge.
Hmm.
They don't want any bad news out there. This for me was unusual for a transportation agency, but I'm encountering it increasingly. Um, and that is not my objective. you know I think both of us have the objective to convey accurate information, and in a sense I think it's very important to have a good working relationship and to have good information exchange. And a lot of times I say to people I interface with on the communication side, look, I just want to get this right. I realize I am annoying you and asking all these stupid questions, but I really want to get this right. I don't want you to call me angry the next day because there's a detail that's wrong. So I think that is important. Part of my objective, though, is also to tell a good story.
Hmm.
We are a subscription newspaper. I mean, I'm honest about that. It's not the same as the Chronicle was in the 1960s, you know. I need to retain audience, you know. Um, I have there's publications out there that as soon as I publish a story, they immediately rehash it with AI and like put out the same thing for free. I have to engage readers as well as convey accurate information, and it's very much a delicate balance. Sometimes it is difficult to explain how that works to people on the communication side who, again, or agency, heads of departments who, again, I would say have like a somewhat, if we have agendas, sometimes they align and sometimes they don't, right? It's interesting. If I may, just one more point.
Sure.
A lot of the transportation projects and agencies I've covered have become extremely controversial, and I'm sure this is also true on the and for my fellows here who are working on the East Coast. High-speed rail, obviously, has become an incredible polarizing political issue. I as much I'm excited to write it, but you know, it's become an incredible political issue in California. Um, and I do think it behooves the people who are running that agency to be accessible within reason, to have their message, convey it to the public, and kind of work with the media, because otherwise there's going to be a lot of misinformation out there.
Mhm.
Transit can also be very polarizing. So, I mean, I am biased in the sense that I'm very like pro fourth estate, obviously, I mean, I think it could be said at this point, like, well, why don't we just all like have our own little social media accounts and just directly talk to the public, I mean, I think it's good to, if you have a message, to work with the media to get it out there and to be accurate, you know? Um, but I will say, like, if you're thinking about our raw objectives, sometimes they align and sometimes, they're going to clash. I'm not always on your team. Maybe I'm looking into something that I think you messed up, and I'm sure Larry will speak to this as well.
Yeah.
So,
Okay, Larry, go ahead.
Well, and I would echo some of basically what Rachel said. Why should they care about the media? Because whether they like it or not, we help get the message out there. We help get the news out there. And I mean it's interesting because with social media and what have you, there are a lot of platforms for an agency to get the news out there, but they may not see it, or they may want turn to us because they want to know, well, what's the entire story? What are they not telling us? What's the full impact? What's the history of this? Why do they have to do it now? Portal Bridge, why do they have to open it one track at a time? Why could and inconvenience us twice? So we help to explain that. Now, the problem is, and I kind of go back, gray whiskers. Um, One of the problems is in doing this is that agencies have become politicized. There was a big difference when our former governor said he was going to fix NJ Transit if it kills him, because immediately that made everything that the agency did a political imperative. So, from my world, where the agency people who had firsthand knowledge of just basic questions, electric trains, catenary, things of that nature. They couldn't answer me directly. They had to vet it through Trenton. They had to
Mm.
vet it through the State House. And this is not only true of NJ Transit, it's true of the DOT as well, because transportation becomes an issue in political campaigns, and you can win or lose votes depending on what you do. One of the things that we had to do was come up with a way to evaluate the departing governor who was term limited. Did he fix NJ Transit in a matter of interviewing experts? Phil, you were one of the people who was interviewed, talking to commuters out in the field, and the consensus. And the thing is, the agencies had their own agendas for that. They were ready to come forth with, here is literally our manifesto of everything good that the governor did. And while we're not saying that he didn't do anything, it's a work in progress. And that can be a problem getting that across to readers, because what readers will say is, well, you're in their back pocket, I bet you ride for free. I've actually had to show them and say, I'll put my ticket wallet out there on the app anytime for you to take a look at it. But and the thing is, there are so many different constituencies, because we may write a story about the corporate transit fee. This is a good thing for riders. You're not going to lose service. And we're going to have the State Chamber of Commerce saying, well, we think it's a bad thing because we already have enough business taxes in this state, and we're not competitive. And this is one more. And so there's that kind of that push and pull, also reminding them that, well, this is how your people get to work. You know, they don't magically descend out of a bubble. So, there's always that push and pull of explaining things. And, I mean, we have our differences. You know, if you had somebody from NJ Transit here, they would probably say, you know, we have difference with you about this, that. Sometimes it's about headlines, and you have to kind of re-educate them about what a headline is supposed to do. You know, one of the biggest problems we also have is that statistically, we have metrics that will show that people do not read an entire story all the way to the bottom. They will get through, if you're lucky, they'll get through the first 3 or 4 graphs, and that's it. So, you know, that changes how we present the information and get it out there. So, of course, that also makes us, you know, conversant in working with, you know, our video staffs, things like that. Our video staff produces 10-second TikTok long videos. So we're trying to boil it down into that tiny little soundbite to get it out there. But for a lot of times, coming back to the original topic, why should they care about the media? Because your clients, customers, come to us when they have a problem. Sometimes they'll come to us instead of coming to you, and sometimes they'll come to us when they feel they haven't gotten a satisfactory response from you.
Thanks, Larry. So, Joanna, your perspective on this.
Yeah, because I'm one of those folks that has to communicate out. I think we walk a fine line when it comes to things like whether it's decaying infrastructure, crisis communication, where you have a situation where you've had a bridge that's fallen in the water. And I'll use the crisis communication perspective. While in the midst of trying to literally rescue people, rescue and recovery, people were asking us questions about structural engineering. And of course, you know, the FSK Bridge is a legacy bridge. That bridge was built when I was a child. I literally grew up at the foot of that bridge. The community, the African American community that worked at the steel mills and things like that, that's the neighborhood that birthed me. And so I remember when that bridge went up and what it meant, and to see that bridge hit the water and know that we were dealing with not only the immigrant families whose husbands and brothers had perished in that incident, we were also dealing with legacy issues of communities that have been disenfranchised that now are looking at a bridge that was a bridge to opportunity, getting them to work and things of that nature, vanishing. We were dealing with a lot of the human aspect and couldn't really answer the technical questions. But that's an analogy to what happens in a lot of situations. We're dealing with folks want technical answers, and sometimes we're trying to solve for the human aspect of it. Like, why are we having issues with this train? Well, it deals with legacy funding, where funding wasn't a priority for this project. In the meantime, trying to explain the technical aspects of it to a variety of audiences. I will tell you that my mantra is always about, again, I start with this, with transparency where we can, while we're trying to really cultivate the message and not spin the message. Cultivate the message to say, give the facts, right? These are the facts on the ground. But I want to go back to something that what you all said about the political aspects. Everything we do in transportation is political, right? Because you inherit projects that other administrations may have started and didn't maybe appropriately finish or execute, and you're left, if you come into an administration and you have to either finish that project, because you can't just say, okay, well, I know you poured $3 billion into it, we really don't want to pour another $3 billion into it and cut it off halfway, or you end up with what Baltimore has, which is a highway to nowhere, right? Where we have highways that uprooted African American communities and poor communities, and then the highway just stops dead in the middle of the city, right? So we're dealing with the backdrop of, you sometimes have projects that start with one administration and you inherit it. And how do you message that? How do you say to the reporters that this isn't the same, you know, way that we're operating this business model, and we still have to compete for dollars? I will say that I tend to be proactive with media content. We give exclusives. We know that there are certain reporters that tend to give us the benefit of the doubt. So we give them exclusives. We give them the ability to have the story before it's made public, before the press release comes out. So we do embargoed stories with key reporters, bring them in, talk them through, walk them through. They're still going to print whatever they want to print, but at least we build that kind of trust that they're getting the story before it hits the interweb, as my son likes to say, and before the spin happens, right? The other thing is we are using our own assets. We put our folks out there to give statements. I think I'm really lucky and blessed to be in a state where I have a governor that's pretty progressive, and he trusts the leaders. And so even though we may not always bring him good news, he's like, go out there and tell the story. So we've been writing op-eds about things like around bridge funding. We have the ability to respond in real time to the business community. But we do keep we keep the governor informed. We do keep his key staff because this is an election year. So we have to keep him informed, but he's not pretty heavy handed on shaping the message. It's always about deliver, tell the truth, and do what you're supposed to do because I've empowered you to work on behalf of the citizens of Maryland. We don't always get it right. Again, I'm going back to my point. We have to compete for dollars across the nation to support and rebuild legacy projects like subways and light rails and even purchasing buses. And then I'm going to throw this bomb out there. When we have Buy America clauses and things like that, and we don't have those type of manufacturing facilities and plants in our country, which delays, you go into a queue and you're behind 30 other states that are trying to get buses or light rail trains or metro trains built. And I'm not saying I have anything against Buy America. I'm saying we need manufacturing to be able to adhere to some of the regulations that impact the quality of service that you get out there on the system. So, yeah, it's a yin and a yang. It's a yin and a
yang. We've gotten some questions here from people who were saying, "Ooh, how can we get the media to report on our story?" So transit agencies are asking questions like, "We don't want people to focus on unhoused individuals or unsafe situations. We want them to write positive stories." And a metropolitan planning organization is saying, "Oh, how can we get somebody to focus on what we're doing?" So do they have a shot at getting good positive stories about their stuff? And if they do, how should they go about it? I'm asking the reporters here.
Well, I'll go first. Um, the big thing is, and I have a tough time explaining this to folks, is that, we are an eyes on, and, Rachel, you touched on it a bit. We are an eyes on media. Okay. Content views basically says to management, you're putting your resources in the right places. Or if a story doesn't get a lot of views, we can't put the resources there. I mean, there was a story that I stopped covering because only 1,000 people were reading it. And that's just, if you look at the railroad sort of passenger per mile cost, that's not cost effective. I could be doing something else. So the thing is, it depends on how it resonates with the readers. And this is always a tough sell for agencies because sometimes they'll come up with something that is interesting to them, but it's a little bit of inside of baseball. So what I would say to them is you've got to be able to put it in what is the impact on the reader and the user. Okay. So, I mean, obviously things like projects, new buses, new trains, even the run up process into doing that, taking us out to the work site, that kind of thing, or, giving us the information when, we're in the kind of boring but very important planning and design stage. So people will get in that process and you won't wind up with readers or your users saying, "Hey, I never heard of this until now. What are you guys trying to keep from me?" And the same that goes for some of the planning organizations too. I had worked with the county planning department, and they love to get stuff in print, but I had to reinforce that, to sometimes saying to the engineers, "Okay, tell me what you just told me in English, so I
Mm.
can tell my readers that."
Mm. Andrew and Rachel, either one of you? Okay, Rachel.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, no, I was just like nodding my head so much with Larry because I've had so many I I mean I just feel Larry, I feel very simpatico. We have like a similar role. Um I I've had some painful conversations with agencies like just telling them like look, nobody's going to read that story, you
Mm.
know. Um there are some stories that we know nobody's going to read and we need to write them because they're just plain important. There are some stories that cross that threshold.
Can you give an example?
For example, um, there's a very hard to explain arcane, I haven't studied it enough, situation in California where the state is about to change the way it allocates cap and trade funds, and it would like potentially eviscerate all these transit agencies. And as you can hear, when I said cap and trade, a lot of you just tuned out. Like, it got no readers. It was extremely important. People like it was hard to explain. It was, you had to explain it as simple as possible. This could like completely kill transportation. It could kill all these other things, you know. But I think even the agencies knew when they were pitching that this is boring but important. So
Mm,
there are a few, but an increasingly like vanishingly small number of the stories that kind of cross that boring but important threshold where it's like, okay, we got to write about this, you know, because it's just so important, you know. But I mean, I am with Larry here, I think, in that like we're making that calculus a lot more often. How boring is this? How many people are really going to engage with this? You know, and more often it's just like I can't afford, I'm gonna cry. I'm gonna yell verklempt. I can't I can't afford to do stories that are not gonna engage readers. Um, when we're looking at stories, there's a few things that I personally consider. So, stories that are successful, maybe one, they have sweep. You know, we put out something that's like a big project that maybe has like some national scope, you know, that's really interesting and like speaks to the cultural moment. Two, stories that have a utility purpose, you know. Um, if BART is threatening to close stations, which ones? Give me the 10 that are on the list. You
mhm,
know, like just stuff that really affects people's lives, like right now, what we used to call news you can use. And then like a third thing is like tension, conflict, drama. People love that.
mm,
You know, so like those are things. And again, like this is why I say like you know, I was really, really interested in what Joanna was relating with the example of like crisis communications and the bridge collapse and like you're having to deal with all these annoying reporters coming back with what we used to call the second day story, except now it's a first day story of like, oh, well, tell me like what was wrong with the structural engineering. Tell me what was wrong with the blah blah blah. You know, like what about those pylons? You know, like no 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 no. What about this historic example of blah blah blah? I get assigned those stories all the time, and I can just imagine the Zoom meeting that was happening in all the newsrooms, you know, as soon as they got wind of the crisis, that, you know, the editor saying, like, okay, you do the story about the structural problems, and you do the story about the blah blah blah, and you do the, you know, and I could totally see from the other end like what was happening in that situation. Um, so yeah, as far as like getting the stories you want out there, I mean, like the best, like this is like the context that we're coming from as reporters, and like I think the best thing you can do is like have good relationships with reporters, you know? I mean, that's just naturally going to help you,
mm.
you know? Talk to them like regular humans. Be the person that like I want to call like, "Hey, what's going on? What do you think about this? What's your take on this?" There's a few people I do that with, like it's, you know, I don't know, I feel like you want to be that person.
Huh. Do you have a lot of off the record phone calls with folks?
I would say that in every beat I've ever covered, you know, I have a few people who I just consider like, and I'm sure Larry and Andrew have them too. You know, there's like those two or three people who are like, this person is just really smart.
Uh-huh.
They're just really smart. They know what's going on. They have good ideas. They understand what makes a good story. Like they sort of understand my job.
Mm,
Whether I quote them or not, like just take out off the record, like, you know, like I can trust this person. I can run a story idea by this person and they will tell me if I'm totally off track, if I'm
mm,
full of, you know, BS, if I'm, you know, or like, you know, you're looking at it the wrong way. This is what's, I'll tell you what's really happening. Um, you know, it's like there's just like no BS. You know, it's like that really, really smart friend who you could go to.
mm.
And I feel like there's a few, yeah, like best sources, I guess you could say.
Okay. So talking about smart friends, there's a topic where it seems like every single day I'm talking to somebody about it, which is artificial intelligence. So can you tell me how it's changing all of your world? So Joanna, you want to go first?
I
Joanna,
can
you.
honestly say that it definitely is changing our world in a number of ways. Number one, we talk about shaping stories and narratives. Even when I have to tell you guys, just again, back to Key Bridge, when I got that call, shortly after I got the call, the video was sent to me very quickly. And I thought it was AI. I was like, there's no way that's real, right? But I would say the way that artificial intelligence is changing what we do is even things like about safety, around public safety. When folks share videos online, how it's amplified, where they're saying things happen, we have to now double check and before we act on certain things from a public safety perspective. That's how artificial intelligence is changing us. Also in messaging, we're very cognizant of when our senior leaders go out and speak. We typically take and we have transcripts of what they say and having them say a message so that what they're saying is not manipulated. And then finally, we've developed AI policies around what our employees can do as far as when they're doing research. Because when you put things into AI, confidential information, that can be used again in the public sphere, and you have to be very careful. So we developed AI policies about the use, even within our building, of information that's proprietary, that could be compromise safety. So even from a research perspective, how our employees conduct research and putting information that's proprietary, whether it's about bids, procurement, and things of that nature, we have to be very careful about using AI and even writing things like RFPs and things of that nature. We have to talk to our employees about the use of AI. It can be very helpful on things like predictive modeling and traffic flows. But on the flip side, when it comes to things like contracts and public facing things, you should be very careful to check the accuracy. So it is shaping how we communicate, how we share stories, and how we validate the information that we share. And it is definitely challenging, but I do want to go back to one previous point. When we talk about our relationship to employees, to the reporters, what I'm saying to the folks who report to me is cultivate those relationships. Don't just call them when you need something. Give them everything, share information, give them insights. They may use it, they may not, but at least they're on the inside and you're telling them, hey, there's a major project that we're going to be announcing, or there's a new grant that we're about to announce that we got. Hold on to it, but you'll be the first to announce that, and you can shape the story around sustainability or around a new environmental grant or whatever. So we, again, that whole thing about embargoed stories and cultivating relationships, we give scoops. We let folks know so they don't have to just find out about it from a press release from, feds. They get it from us, so we start to build and cultivate those relationships. So don't just call on your friends when you're in trouble. Give them a little niblet, and they can decide whether it's something that they can feed off of, or they're like, thanks, I'll put it in the kitty. So that's my answer on that.
Okay. So Andrew, I'm sure you think about this all the time, right?
Yes. AI has become a very dominant area of coverage for The Verge. Obviously, we are staying on top of all of the major developments, trying to test out the products, offer our readers insight into how they work. At the same time, it's obviously has very huge repercussions for our business, for journalism. We have had to create sort of policies sort of on the fly about how our journalists use AI. We have a pretty strict red line about not ever publishing any AI slop on our site. Like that's just something that we will never do, and we're very upfront about that. And I know a lot of other publications have made decisions to publish AI produced or AI generated content, and that is not something that The Verge will ever do. So we have to be very strict about that kind of stuff. It's interesting the sort of the recent discussions around AI. I feel like I've been covering AI for like almost a decade now, especially with regards to autonomous vehicles. Right, this is physical AI. This is AI out in the world. It's only recently that these large language models have become more prominent. That the conversation has and the attention has sort of shifted to focus on these chatbots. But I feel like I've been sort of like ahead of the game in some respects. I'm sure Rachel feels the same way, that we've been covering AI, since Google first started testing its vehicles in California. But that said, I would say that I feel like it has huge implications for the transportation sector. Trying to stay on top of the news can be increasingly difficult, and just sort of kind of overlapping a little bit with the prior question about like what makes a news story, what doesn't make a news story, and how we interact with the various agencies and the officials and the people that are sort of in charge our systems and these giant, sort of like infrastructure projects, that, realizing that journalists are just sort of, trying to cover these large beats, or just, single people, and we can't sort of cover the broad swath of everything that we'd like to, and that 9 out of 10 pitches that you may make to a journalist may fall flat, but that 10th pitch may be a real winner, and that it is something that the outlet or the reporter might be really excited to cover. I think it's just sort of like being, sticking to it and making sure that the conversation stays open and free flowing, and that there's back and forth. And I completely agree with Rachel that, that sometimes it's just great to have conversations with people that isn't about a pitch, or isn't about a specific story that they're trying to hand over to you, that is just more sort of about what's going on today, what's going on in the news, what's crossed your feed, what do you find that's interesting and exciting out there. And those are the people that I really like talking to the most, and it does deepen the relationship and make it so that when there is a pitch, when there is a story that they're trying to get me to report on, or something that they'd like to see published on our site, I feel like that I do have a more respect and a deeper relationship with some of those folks, and it will lead me to maybe take a harder look or more consideration, because I do have that kind of that trust, that foundation of trust there. But yeah, no, the AI stuff is just it's everywhere, and I feel like it's our job as reporters to cut through the hype, to cut through the bullshit, to make sure that readers sort of are presented with sort of the straight facts as much as they can get. Especially around this particular topic, when there is so much obfuscation and so much money pouring into the space, which leads then to further kind of hype and obfuscation. It can be increasingly a daunting task to sort of pick apart all of the various threads and say, this is what's real, this is what's fake, this is what's legit, and this is slop. And we're finding increasingly that our readers are really engaged on these topics, and they have really strong emotions and feelings around these things, and they're not going to hesitate to tell us about it too. So we're certainly paying really close attention to all of these developments, especially around sort of the use of AI by state agencies, by the federal government, right? There's executive orders that are being signed. There's a lot of money going back and forth between these companies and the federal government that I think deserves a lot more scrutiny,
Yeah.
that we really need to be paying attention to. So that's something that I feel like,
Yeah. Okay. So we're actually out of time, but I want to give like Rachel and Larry like 30 seconds to just respond to this. So Larry, why don't you go 30 seconds? I got my clock out.
Okay. Well, first of all, like Andrew, our organization has a very strong policy on the use of AI. It is not allowed to self-publish ever. It always has to be reviewed by a human being. And, we even have guidelines about using it to create first drafts. You know what I mean? The stuff that gets put through first draft creator are basically press releases, things like that. It's a good tool. I mean, as somebody who's dyslexic, as you just saw, the editing tools, grammar tools are great, but even they have to be watched like a hawk. Our tool still thinks that Mikey Sherrill, the governor, her name is Michelle. Okay. So you have to watch out for things like that. And the thing is, what I would say is reporters and other users cannot be lazy about just let AI do it for you. And, I'm lucky to have an organization that says, here are the guardrails.
Okay. And Rachel, you get the last word.
Oh God, I'll be quick. This is so fascinating. Um, my organization has chosen not to fight AI, embrace it. That's like the mantra. Um, how do I say that really quickly? We use it for research that would probably take a lot of time. Um, we try to really diligently fact check it. Um, I do ask it grammar questions.
Mhm.
Um, sometimes it writes better than I do. Most of the time it doesn't.
Yes.
Um, I'm I hate it. Some in most of the time, I'm deathly afraid that AI is going to take my job. Um, it ruins my life because bots scrape my content every time I work
Uh,
extremely hard to create an original human thought of writerly story that
yeah.
just gets repurposed for free by bots.
Okay. All right.
Those are just like, yeah, that's off the cuff thoughts on AI.
Okay. So let me just say thanks, Andrew. Thanks,
Yeah.
Rachel, Joanna, Larry. I think this was great. I enjoyed it. I appreciated everybody's insight today. And thanks to all of you for participating. You're going to be able to find a recording of the webinar on our website, enotrans.org. And the recording will also be emailed to everybody who registered. You should make sure to sign up for our mailing list so you can gain access to Eno Transportation Weekly, our webinar announcements, when we release reports and other things great things that we do. And reminder, check out the link in the chat box about donating or becoming a member. And thanks again, and have a great day.